There we go.
Okay.
Okay. So yes, Huntly Castle, up in Aberdeenshire. It's the first castle at Huntly was called Strathbogie, built for the Earls of Fife in the 1100s. From the 1300s onwards, it became the home of the Gordon family, who then lived there for the next 300 years or so. And the association with the Gordons would shape both the fabric of the building and the stories that it leaves behind. I know that chatting to a few of you before, that Huntley is special to many of you. Can I do a quick round the room of who's actually been there? Yeah. Oh, it's a good turnout. Excellent. It is particularly beautiful. Um, this is where it sits on the map. Um, and yeah, right in the heart of Aberdeenshire. I particularly love the description of it in the 1845 statistical account, where it says, "The town of Huntly is embosomed in hills. Its climate, though cold, is exceedingly healthful. The water of the Bogie is pure and fit for every purpose. It produces excellent trout." Um, there we can get a good sense there. And oh, now I've clicked off it again. Okay. And here we have it on a map of 1640. So we can see how close it sits to the meeting point of the rivers Bogie and Devon there in the middle, and how surrounded by forests it is. Um, Again, the minister in the, you can tell how much I love the statistical accounts in general. They're so full of comedy. I really do recommend them if you want a slightly amusing afternoon. Um, but the 1794 minister statistical account said, two pleasant rivers run on each side of it, the Devon on the west and the Bogie on the east, both uniting half a mile below it, where they present a delightful and romantic scene, and thus uniting glide over a rough and rocky channel, shaded with trees on each side, till they fall into the sea at Banff, 21 miles northeast of Huntly. So essentially, this is a strategic point in an area rich with natural resources and well connected to other power centres in the region. And here we have one of the particularly lovely things about Huntly is how readable its history is in the surviving fabric of the site. So you can see the 1100s motte here, and at the top of the illustration on the far side there. So that would have once had a timber tower castle building on it. Um, and then in the sort of flatter area of land next to it, that would have been the bailey, which would have held the workshops, stables, supporting buildings for the tower. We can also see on the illustration there the sort of footings of an L-shaped building, which was the sort of the stone tower house that followed on from the wooden tower house, and which was later replaced by the Renaissance buildings, the medieval and Renaissance buildings that we can see here, that more of which survives today. So it's a very um, rich site to explore. There's a lot that you can still see of that history over the centuries. And you may be wondering, why did we need a new guidebook? Um, this, I think, is something that, while I've worked in this job, you tend to assume that because we've known about these sites for hundreds of years, kind of like, how can you possibly have that much new information about them? Do they really need more interpretation or reinterpreting? And surprisingly, the answer is always yes. There is always so much more that we can say than has been said in the past. There's always new research findings and new understandings of the places to incorporate. And and every age asks different questions, right? So we're always asking different questions and taking different approaches to what was taken in the past. So we have a spread from the last guidebook shown here, which was published in 2006. And in those 20 years, some of our understandings and focuses have changed quite a lot. Apart from anything else, we've now moved towards an updated design style. Uh, our current design partners are Orchid Broccoli Sky, ABG Design, and they've done a really lovely job on the new guidebook, which you might have seen over there, but that's what it looks like. So you can see a sort of a updating in the fonts, the design style that makes it more accessible. We tend to use far more accessible contrast levels and amounts of text now, and different layouts. And so yeah, the design style itself is a driver for a new one. But we also have quite a lot of content reasons for updating the guidebooks as well. So to demonstrate, I've taken one spread here from the old guidebook. This rather wonderful image is used from the Battle of Neville's Cross down in County Durham, and the that's from a manuscript that's in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and it's obviously being used as the star of the show on this spread. But unfortunately, once Morvern started researching, she didn't find any evidence that it was relevant, and that Alexander Gordon actually died there, as is suggested in the last guidebook. And looking through the rest of the text as well, you can see um, it's very battle focused. It can start to read a little like a list of men, um, and yes, you might think that women didn't really live at this castle at all and had barely anything to do with it. When Morven and I were first reading through the old guidebook, we were writing in margins, hint of woman, um, slight essence of woman here. Um, but yes, or that you'd either you'd be mistaken for forgiven for thinking that they were either completely absent or that they were just conduits through which the castle passed from one male line to another. Likewise, the older guidebook does tend to focus solely on the aristocratic residents with less attention paid to the people who were serving and working in the castle and to members of the surrounding community who would have also interacted with it. Um, so these are all reasons for updating the guidebook. Also, the visitors and what the visitors want to know about a place. Every bit of visitor research that we've ever done suggests that people want to know what it was actually like to live in these places, where you would have slept, you would have eaten, what the stories of the people who interacted with this place were. And so I think that has definitely led to a shift over this past period away from that quite battle and defense focused style of interpretation through to a more living interpretation of how were these places used. So in the guidebooks, we have to make images work very hard. We have very limited amounts of space, and in this particular guidebook, we campaigned for 56 pages rather than 36, which is the normal because the stories are so rich, and to do justice to the site, we really needed more room. But still, you've got thousands of people interacting with this site over the years. Um, so many rich stories, and incredibly rich fabric in itself to tell those stories. So we can't do it all in words. We have to use the images at our disposal to bring that to life. So yeah, we use a range of different types of images, and we try and make these do different jobs and kind of form that fuller picture. We always intend to use good new photography of the sites. One of the main functions of the guidebooks are to provide people with a souvenir of what they've seen and have something to take away that helps them remember it. But it also allows us to direct people's attention towards specific features and say, look for this thing that you might have not noticed, or yeah, explaining. For example, here we've got the the old housing for the vats in the brew house. So this indent survives. And then we have a more general scene of the courtyard there. We also use commissioned illustrations, and we work with artists. We've got some fabulous artists that we've worked with over the years. So this one is done by Stephen Conlon, and you can see how incredibly detailed those interiors are. And this allows us to recreate the castle as it would have been at a particular moment in time. Sometimes we might show particular events. It might be immediately after someone's birth or during a party or that kind of thing. But this, yeah, helps us to, we make those decisions based on the individual stories, the challenges at each site. Sometimes we might also commission new plans or sections depending on what architecturally is challenging or significant to understand in that place. We also use a wide range of historic images, and these again fulfill several purposes. They illustrate very specific moments in time, but they also give a sense of history to the book so that you can, you're getting that visual language changing throughout time and feeling the aesthetic sense of the different periods that are covered. And we use historic photography. So here we have a couple of women from the Aberdeenshire Historical Society visiting the castle. And one of the things that I particularly love about this one is Morvern was like, is there a more in focus version? Is there? But I love that you can kind of see that the focus is actually quite sharp just behind them. So it tells you a little bit about the history of photography there and the process and the materiality of that object, as well as giving us a glimpse into the doings of the Aberdeen Historical Society and the lives of these women. Um, and now I'll pass over to Morvern for a little bit to take us through some of the specific illustrations that we developed for this guidebook and some more of the specific stories.
Okay, thank you. So one of the new illustrations that we had made for this new guidebook is it was done by the Malting Studio, I should say.
Speak up a little bit, please.
Sorry. It's based on an entry in the Treasurer's accounts in 1504. Is that better?
Slightly. Would you like to move forward? No, it's okay.
So the entry says, item in Strathbogie, which, as we heard, is the old name for Huntly, to the minstrels and the moor, to their horses' meat, 14 shillings. And meat here just means food. It doesn't mean necessarily meat. And I should also say that moor in this context is a derogatory historic term. So I'm using it as a quote, but it's not a word we would necessarily use today. And the meaning of the word moor is not always completely clear. Sometimes it means someone of African or Arabic descent, including sometimes Muslim people. And there were lots of such people living in Europe at this time. For example, until 1492, southern Spain was ruled by Muslims. Um, in the treasurer's accounts for James IV, the earliest reign for which these records survive in any great number, there's evidence for several so-called Moorish people at his court. Some may have been brought to Scotland against their will. It's not clear how exactly they came. And they include people like Peter the Moor, whose occupation is unknown, but who appeared in the accounts in 1500, then left Scotland forever in 1504. Other notable people were Ellen and Margaret Moore, who were illustrated on the screen here. Two young women or girls who arrived in Scotland in 1504 too. They became ladies to Margaret, the daughter of James IV and Margaret Drummond, and later they worked for Queen Margaret Tudor. And you might actually recognise them if any of you went to Rona Munro's play, James IV, Queen of the Fight in 22. They were two of the main characters in that. But what about our person at Huntly? Unfortunately, we don't know his name, only that he was called the Moor Tobrenar, or the Moorish drummer, a tabor being a kind of drum. This drummer first appeared in the historical record in 1504 and accompanied the king on the king's frequent travels around the country. He would have provided day-to-day music, as well as performing for ceremonial entries and other special occasions. For example, he devised a dance for Shrove Tuesday celebrations in 1505. As we can see here, clothing was made for 12 dancers by the Moor Tobrenar's device or design, again, Pastringus Eben, which is Shrove Tuesday. The Moor Tobrenar appeared at Huntly alongside a group of minstrels who are elsewhere referred to as four Italian minstrels. And we know from other records that these were shawm players, so they played a kind of woodwind instrument while he played the drum. So these musicians accompanied James IV. James had been at Tain in the north of Scotland on pilgrimage at the shrine of St. Duffic. Then they stopped at Darnaway in Murray to visit James's mistress and his child. And then they came to Huntly, and they would have been greeted by Alexander Gordon and Jean Stewart, the Earl and Countess of Huntly. We know the musicians' horses at least were fed before the court continued its journey south. We know that the Moor Tobrenar had a wife and child who were provided with expenses in 1504 and 1507. He suffered some sort of injury in 1506 because he was compensated for the hurting of him, and a doctor was employed to treat him. And finally, in August 1507, his drum was transferred to another musician, perhaps ominously. We don't know exactly what happened. We wanted to incorporate the Moor Tobrenar into the new guidebook and had this new illustration made, which included him. In 1505, the drummer was given 28 shillings for the painting of his tabor. And this could have been a possible repainting, so we employed some artistic license and showed him with a painted drum in 1504 too. You might be able to make out the thistle and daisy design on the side of the drum, which are representative of James IV and Margaret Tudor. I'll pass over back to Sally now.
Thank you very much. But in the effort to widen our lens and to not just tell the tales of the aristocratic residents of of the castle, we also wanted to talk about one of the major gaps in the interpretation of this place in the past, and really, honestly, kind of pretty much every other building in Scotland, is the contribution made by the gypsy and traveller community to the culture and way of life. Um, We've been lucky enough to have Verna Ramsey's advice on this as well. And I think for many of these different subjects that we're talking about as well, we'll have gone out to different experts and talked to different people um, around the Scottish academic community to make sure that we're really representing people as much as possible. So traveller communities have been an important part of cultural life in Scotland, particularly the Northeast, for hundreds of years. Many of the castle's objects, from pots and pans all the way through to fine jewelry, would have been either made or mended by itinerant craft workers. Often members of the gypsy or traveller communities, they moved wherever their skills were needed. And they worked in brass, pewter, silver, wood, leather, and horn. And, I think one of the reasons behind the historic emission of these stories is partly the way these places are preserved now often means that the fabric of the building is quite separate from the objects. So the objects might end up in museums where the fabric is looked after by a different organization, and some of it is, historical bias as well. Um, but the traveller community's contribution doesn't just lie in the tangible heritage, in those objects that survive or don't, but also in the intangible cultural heritage attached to this place as well. So at the end of the presentation, we'll get up a recording of the singer here, Jeannie Robertson, who some of you may have heard of, come across, singing the Three Gypsies. And this was one of the verses from it. You can see that it mentions he's rode through Strathbogie. So in the version recorded in I think it was 57 that yeah, this particular recording that survives of her singing was made. uh it it tells the tale of um a lady in a great castle who hears the singing of the three gypsies outside her door, and she falls in love with the singing, decides to leave her house and lands, and she's at war with the gypsies. It's also sometimes called the Raggle-Taggle gypsies. Um, and then her husband comes back and he hunts for her and he finds her often in a field, and there's normally a very beautiful exchange. Um, of why did you leave your house and your land? Why did you leave your money? Oh, um, and she always replies, I'd rather sleep in the fields than in my feather bed. Um, and in this particular version, the gypsies are actually executed at the end of it, which doesn't happen in every version of the song. Um, so that we'll never know whether this is a song that originated in the Huntly area, that the mention of Strathbogie in this particular version is because it was associated with the doings of the family at the castle, um, or if the folk singers in that area placed that name into the ballad because it was familiar to them and that's what they knew. There are many, many versions of this song out there around the world. But I think, these songs are still sung today. They're an important part of our cultural heritage, often passed down through generations of traveller communities and families. And yeah, and they tell us about what was considered important in an area, the different identities of an area, and how they remain significant, pulled into the modern day. And now I'll pass back to Morvern again after that short interlude.
Thank you, Sally. So another character that stood out to me when researching the new guidebook was Elizabeth Brodie, who is Duchess of Gordon to the 5th Duke of Gordon. So the previous edition of the guidebook that we saw earlier only really went up to the mid-17th century when the Gordons ceased to live at Huntly. However, that was, of course, not the end of the castle's life, as we'll see. So Elizabeth's father, he made his fortune as a merchant in the East India Company in Madras. So she was a very wealthy heiress. And in 1813, she married George Gordon, at that time the heir to the Duchy of Gordon. And it was quite an unlikely pairing. So we have evidence from the diarist Elizabeth Grant of Roppy Marcus, who provides us with colourful descriptions of the pair of them. She says, Duchess Elizabeth, she says, was an excellent woman with a clear business head, good temper, and high principles. She soon set straight all that she found crooked. George, in contrast, he was a bit older. He had been around the block a bit. Elizabeth Grant says he was in the decline of his rackety life, overwhelmed with debts, sated with pleasure, tired of fashion. He just needed a rich wife, basically, to sort him out. um, so until 1827, when they came into the Duchy of Gordon, George and Elizabeth lived at Huntly Lodge. This is about 600 metres north of the castle. It later became the Castle Hotel. So in the image on the left, you've got the castle in the foreground. There's an avenue of trees running up the right, and then you can see the Huntly Lodge at the top right there, and then a closer image on the right-hand side. So just before they moved to Gordon Castle, which is at Fauconbers, sort of towards Elgin, she visited Huntly Castle one more time with her friends. And her biographer, Alexander Moody Stewart, described this visit. He said she was saddened at leaving scenes she had loved so well and deeply burdened with the vast responsibility of the role of Duchess. When she was on the second floor of the castle, uh, Moody Stewart says a sunbeam suddenly burst in and shone onto an inscription on the opposite wall. And it's the inscription I've pulled out, it's on the lintel of this fireplace. I've pulled it out along the bottom there. It says, to those that love God, all things work to the best. So believe in God, everything will be okay. And Stuart wrote, when she saw this inscription, the burden was lifted in an instant from her spirit, and she went forward relieved and gladdened. Ever after, Romans 8:28 was one of the pillars that upheld the temple of God in her heart, and so on from many pages. So bearing in mind, Stuart was actually a minister, and he was one of Elizabeth's sort of followers, so to speak. We can take this with a pinch of salt, but it still tells us the castle played a role in her increasing piety. And it's tempting to imagine as well, when she was looking at the fireplace, she was contemplating her predecessor for who it was made, Marchioness Henrietta Stuart. And Henrietta's portrait appears on a different fireplace, which you can see also there. And Henrietta, like Elizabeth, was known for her cleverness and efficiency, and she also took care of Huntly on her husband's behalf. So she could have kind of been like a role model to Duchess Elizabeth. So, no, that's intentional. uh, just to show it again. So after George's death in 1836, Elizabeth came back to live at Huntly Lodge again. And she was always deeply religious. But in 1846, she converted from Church of Scotland to the newly established Free Church of Scotland. And at Huntly Lodge, the Sabbath was strictly observed. For example, on Sundays, no fire was lighted in the drawing room, both to save unnecessary work and to present no inducement for visitors to meet together for idle conversation. I think she kind of sounds like a nightmare, but also kind of, she sounds really bossy and commanding. I quite like that. In 1847, Elizabeth organised for Sunday service to take place at the castle itself. Moody Stewart says she ordered the grass to be cut within the open bounds of the ruins, and the broad green area of what had once been the castle court to be placed at the service of the congregation. The ancient fortress was turned into a temple. So it's literally in the middle of the castle. She assembles, all interested people and ministers to hold a service there. And Moody Stewart says he was there. He says the attendees thought themselves lucky that the wild revelry and dark superstition that reigned under the popish Earls of Huntly were over. So the Huntleys were Catholic for a long time after the Reformation as well. But he's saying, oh, thank God that time has passed now. You know, those days are gone. In the 1860s, she held further religious gatherings in the castle park, just inside the entrance at the Gordon Schools, which she herself had founded some 20 years earlier. So there's the entrance. If you visit Huntly today, if you're coming from the town, you enter through the Gordon Schools that Elizabeth founded. So she had these further religious services held just inside the gate, and she set up special trains and everything to bring in local school children, gave them tea and buns. But lest anyone have too much fun, she wrote that these meetings were not a rendezvous for a pleasant day in the country, but really very solemn meetings where the presence of the Lord is felt and the power of his spirit manifested. Which made me wonder, how much did the children actually want to be there? But they got their tea and their buns, so it was okay. So Elizabeth died at Huntly Lodge in 1864, and when her husband had died almost 30 years earlier, the title and estates had been inherited by the Duke of Richmond, and it was a later Duke of Richmond in 1923 who entrusted Huntly Castle into state care. But for now, pivoting back into Huntly's Renaissance past, the time of the so-called wild revelry and dark superstition, we know quite a lot actually about how the castle used to look and how it was furnished in its heyday, as alluded to by Sally when she showed the cutaway illustration that we have. This is down to a rich collection of written evidence which survives, including inventories, as well as physical survivals at the castle itself. As early as 1481, surviving records indicate that Elizabeth Hay, Countess of Huntly, was serving her servants to Aberdeen to acquire goods like dyes, fish, and wine for the household. These records are from the Aberdeen Council records, Aberdeen Council registers, which are searchable online, and they're evidence of the everyday items that were bought for the household at Huntly over 500 years ago, and how the lady of the house managed those purchases. And actually, these records only appear in the council registers because something went wrong. She was suing someone to get what was hers. So there would have been many more purchases that haven't been recorded or the records haven't survived. But she was quite litigious and fierce about getting the goods that belonged to her. Okay. Later in 1562, we know about the castle's contents in that year because George, 4th Earl of Huntly, had a sort of conflict with Mary, Queen of Scots. He was the great power in northeast Scotland, was a rival to the crown, suspected of plotting against the Queen, who had only returned to Scotland from France a year earlier. So it's actually from this period that we get the title of the paper today, The Fairest in the Country, because this is how English Ambassador Thomas Randolph described Huntly. And Mary's forces met Huntly's in battle at Corky, where he suddenly falleth from his horse, stark dead. So he was dealt with. Possibly a stroke or a heart attack or something. But at that point, he was suspected of treason. So Mary sent her soldiers in to loot the castle, took all the stuff that she wanted. And so we know about the contents because of her own inventories. And these included many, for example, silk bed sheets in a rainbow of colours and gold and silver threads, richly decorated with curtains and fringes and other trimmings. There were also vestments from Aberdeen Cathedral, which had been hidden in the castle at the time of the Reformation, some made of cloth of gold and encrusted with precious stones and pearls. So you can get an example of that sort of richness from the image on the screen. And there are a couple of later inventories of the castle from 1648 and around 1728. We can compare what the contents were like when the second Marquess of Huntly was last living there, so that's the 1648 one, versus 80 years later when only the factor or chamberlain who managed the castle and the estate occupied it. So in 1648, the castle contained, again, many lavish bed sheets and furnishings, showing the wealth and status of the family, portrait paintings, legal documents, books, guns, ammunition. And thank you, Michael Pierce, who provided us with the transcript of the 1648 inventory. By the time of the death of Alexander, the second Duke of Gordon in 1728, the only remaining furniture were a few tables, chairs, beds, closed stools or toilets. A lot of them described as coarse, old, or broken. This shows that although the castle was still occupied into the 18th century, the environment was very different from that in its heyday just a few decades before. We also have in the fabric of the castle itself some physical survivals that allude to the full richness of its past appearance. There's the inscription that Sally already showed us on the front of the palace, which read George Gordon, 1st Marquis of Huntly, and Henriette Stuart, Marquis of Huntly. Also the remnants of plaster ceiling cornices on the 1st floor, and even a centuries-old toilet seat. These are quite unusual survivals that we have here. Another survival that's quite remarkable is called the frontispiece. So this is an elaborate carving above the door into the palace. Some elements of it have been defaced. This happened in 1640 when, during the civil wars, the Covenanters took possession of the castle, and they were, I guess you could call them radical Protestants. They didn't like the Catholic symbolism that was on the carvings, so they chipped it off. And they called these carvings somewhat popish and superstitious-like. So these Catholic carvings that are now gone, they are the figure at the very top, the circular panel beneath it. There's an inscription indicated by a pointing hand, and then there's a square panel with flanking rectangles. So this was created in 1602, as indicated by a date on the lintel. The patrons were George Gordon and Henrietta Stuart, who had been made the first Marquis and Marchioness in 1599. And around that time, they made a lot of changes to the palace, and the elaborate carvings that you can see today were commissioned by them. And as I say, they were also devout Catholics, and they made no secret of the fact, despite it not being the official religion by their time. George was implicated in 2 plots with Catholic Spain, but he always seemed to come back into royal favour somehow. And contemporaries said the king had too much affection for Huntly, which could be alluding to potential attraction to Huntly, since James had relationships with men. So the frontispiece has been examined before, and drawings were made by architect Robert Billings and engraved by George Smith in 1852, as well as Huntly-born architect Francis Troop. So on the right, we've got an old interpretation panel showing the frontispiece with the lost elements restored. For the new guidebook, we wanted to re-examine it and show it in its full former glory, how it may have looked at the time of completion over 400 years ago, when it would have been brightly coloured, making a statement to anybody who saw it. And for this new illustration, we were helped by Dr. Penelope Dransart, who's an expert in Catholic material culture, such as these carvings. So it's not always clear in the photos. I'm sorry the photos are not that good, but it's easier to see in person. The fragments of these now lost features survive that give us clues to what they would have been. So first, surmounting the whole was the Archangel Michael, a protective figure who defeated Satan, and Satan's often represented as a dragon. There's also a family connection to France, which had the Order of St. Michael, the chivalric order, which the first Marquis's George grandfather, the 4th Earl of Huntly, he had been a member of that chivalric order. But also a bit closer in time, Henrietta herself, she was French. She was raised there and her mother was French. So there was a sort of cultural connection to Archangel Michael. So traces of the text following the pointed hand survive. It's a Bible verse from Galatians, which translate to God forbid that I should glory save in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. And the pointing hand says, pay attention to this. In the drawings, Billings filled the square panel with quasi-heraldry, but in fact this was once Arma Christi, or objects associated with Christ's crucifixion. Ghostly remnants of which survive on the defaced stonework. Again, it's not easy to see from the photos. At this point, Penelope may have regretted agreeing to help us. I think we possibly drove her a bit mad with all the back and forth drafts and helping to decide very specific things about this because it's quite an elaborate carving. But the biggest change in thinking, however, is the round panel or solar disc beneath the Archangel Michael, which both Billings and Troop left blank. The inscription at the top of the disc says Divina Virtute Resurgo, or I rise again with divine power, so suggesting resurrection. Penelope previously speculated that the image within the disc itself would be Christ's face, and this is how it was shown on our previous interpretation. But on re-examining the surviving stonework, she now suggests it could instead have been another symbol of the resurrection, the pelican in her piety, or a pelican reviving its dead young with its own blood. And so we have the final illustration of the frontispiece created by the Malting Studio. This will be in the new guidebook to help visitors imagine how crisp and colourful it would have looked 400 years ago. So the story of Huntly did not, of course, end with its capture by the Covenanters in 1640. In 1649, George II Marquis was executed for his allegiance to the Royalists in the Civil Wars. And after that time, that's when the family increasingly lived at Gordon Castle to the northwest. The medieval Elplan Tower, the oldest part of the castle then in existence, was dismantled by 1731, and parts of it were used to build Huntly Lodge, where Elizabeth Brodie used to live. In 1776, the painted ceilings of the palace still survived, as described by Banff clergyman and antiquarian Charles Cordner, who wrote that emblematic figures symbolised various virtues, vices, trades, and pursuits. As mentioned earlier, the castle came into state care in 1923 and it continues to function as a visitor attraction to this day. So we hope you've enjoyed this sneak peek at the new guidebook. We've shared only a small number of stories from Huntly's long and fascinating past and how we bring them to life through the interpretation. And we hope this inspires you to visit or revisit the castle and think about the captivating characters who once occupied it.
But it's here od east and here od west and here od